Queen Esther turned a death sentence into the largest wealth transfer in the ancient Persian Empire, and the 3-day strategy she used is the one nobody in finance has dared to teach. Hidden inside the Book of Esther is a blueprint so precise, so counterintuitive, and so spiritually loaded that it does not just explain how a queen saved her people. It explains how ordinary people break the cycle of financial destruction and step into inherited kingdom resources. And before this is over, a final revelation at the end of this teaching will permanently change the way you see crisis, timing, and provision. This is not a survival story. It is an acquisition strategy written by God. Alarm goes off. Before your feet hit the floor, the markets are already moving. Someone you trusted just made a decision that put your financial future at risk. You did not cause it. You did not vote for it. But you are the one who will pay the price. That is exactly where Esther was standing. The decree had already been signed and sealed with the king's ring. Esther, chapter 3, verse 13, reads, "And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, and to plunder their possessions." This was not a threat. It was a legally binding financial and physical death sentence, already in motion, already stamped, already dispatched by horseback to every corner of the Persian Empire. The wealth of an entire people was legally assigned to their enemies before a single sword was raised. Here is what most people miss when they read this story. Esther's first move was not to negotiate. It was not to send a messenger or draft a counter-petition. She stopped everything she was doing and called a fast. 3 full days, 3 full nights. Every Jew in Shushan joined her in it. Esther, chapter 4, verse 16, records her exact words, "Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do." No political strategy behind that, no silver changing hands, just a total, deliberate suspension of every natural mechanism available to her. Stop here and think about what that means for your situation right now. Fasting is a pattern interrupt at the deepest level. It is the physical declaration that you have moved from the economy of human effort into the economy of divine access. Most people only reach for this when everything else has already failed, when the options have run out and desperation sets in. Esther used it before she took a single visible action, while there was still time to choose a different path. That sequence, spiritual positioning first, then strategic movement, is what you find running underneath every major financial reversal in the entire biblical record. And then she walked into the throne room without being summoned. Under Persian law, that was a capital offense. The penalty for entering without invitation was death, unless the king chose to extend his golden scepter. She walked in carrying nothing but the authority she had gathered in 3 days of silence. The king extended the scepter. Favor opened the treasury before a single negotiation began. That is the access principle. The spiritual capital you build in seasons of fasting and surrender creates access points that no amount of natural effort can manufacture. You do not argue your way into the king's chamber. You position yourself, and the scepter comes to you. Right now, wherever you are watching this from, whether you are in a kitchen in Lagos, a bedroom in São Paulo, a studio apartment in Houston, or a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Because this message is not landing by accident. This teaching found you in a season where you need exactly this kind of access. Sir John Templeton spent his entire investment career practicing one counterintuitive principle that most people find emotionally impossible to execute. He said, "The time of maximum pessimism is the best time to buy, and the time of maximum optimism is the best time to sell." In 1939, when Europe was burning, when the headlines screamed collapse, when maximum pessimism had paralyzed every rational investor, Templeton purchased $100 worth of every publicly traded stock available to him under $1 per share. He bought into 104 companies. Within 4 years, that portfolio had returned 400%. He did not discover that principle in a trading book. That principle lives in Esther chapter 4. When the natural world announced maximum pessimism, a signed decree of extermination and plunder, Esther saw a window that panic would have closed. She saw access, she saw timing, and she moved with precision rather than desperation, which is a completely different posture and produces completely different results. Watch what she did next. She got the scepter on her first approach. The king asked her immediately, "What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of the kingdom." Most people would have blurted out the entire petition right there because the relief would have been too overwhelming to resist. But Esther said nothing about the decree. She invited the king to a banquet, just dinner. Esther, chapter 5, verse 4, she said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to the feast that I have prepared." That restraint is the most underteached financial principle in the entire book. She already had the king's favor. The window was already open, but she delayed her ultimate request, not from fear, not from indecision, but from a kind of strategic patience that only comes to a person whose mind has already been stilled. Proverbs chapter 21 verse 5 puts it directly, "The plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty." She was not reacting to the crisis. She was engineering the outcome from the inside out. This is where most people collapse. They get a crack of favor, a small opening, a door that has moved an inch, and they rush through it carrying everything they want all at once. They show the full hand before the room is ready to receive it. Esther held back. She served first. She created an environment of warmth and trust before she placed her real request on the table. If this pattern of ancient wisdom is resonating with you right now, if you are recognizing principles in this story that you have never heard taught this way before, go ahead and like this video. That small action tells the algorithm that this teaching deserves to reach more people who need it. Haman left that first banquet satisfied, celebrating his apparent closeness to the queen, and completely unaware that every step he was taking was being used to build the structure of his own downfall. He had already erected a 50-cubit gallows for Mordecai, expecting to use it the very next morning. Esther, chapter 5, verse 9, records that he went home joyful that day. Here is where God's economy operates in a completely different direction than human logic can predict. That same night, not a week later, not a season later, that very night, the king could not sleep. He called for the royal chronicles to be read aloud to him. The reader landed on the account of Mordecai uncovering an assassination plot years before, a debt of honor that had never been formally repaid. By morning, before Haman could bring his plan against Mordecai to anyone's attention, the king was already asking how to publicly honor him. Haman ended up leading the very man he wanted to destroy through the streets of the city, announcing his dignity before the crowd. What the enemy constructs as a weapon becomes the very mechanism of your elevation. That is not a poetic observation. That is a pattern that repeats itself throughout the entire biblical record, and it has a spiritual law behind it. The Apostle Paul named that law in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." The word Paul used for transformed, metamorphou in the original Greek, is the same root that gives us metamorphosis. He was not describing a slight attitude adjustment. He was describing a complete internal restructuring that changes how you process reality, how you interpret threat, and how you respond to the moment of opportunity when it arrives. Haman was running on an unrenewed mind, driven by pride and an ancient grudge, desperate to prove his power in front of a crowd. Esther was running on something else entirely, a mind quieted by fasting, aligned through submission, sharpened by patience over days, not hours. The difference between them was not political skill or social access. It was the internal operating system each one was using when the critical moment arrived. One built gallows. The other built a legacy that is still being taught thousands of years later. This is the mental metamorphosis Paul is pointing toward. Not positive thinking, not visualization. A deep internal restructuring of what you believe is possible, what you believe you deserve, and what you believe God is actually capable of doing inside a single day. Esther walked into the throne room not carrying a strategy document, but a transformed certainty that had cost her 3 days of everything she had. She had stripped away every layer of fear, every assumption, every reflex that told her to move faster, until what remained was a clarity that cannot be manufactured by willpower alone. And from that place of clarity, she made her request. Esther, chapter 7, verse 3. She named what she wanted without trembling. Let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. No desperation behind those words, no performance. She was asking from a place of settled strength rather than scarcity, and the room felt it. On that same day, the text uses those exact words, that same day, the king gave to Queen Esther the full estate of Haman, everything he owned, his property, his holdings, his accumulated wealth, transferred to the very woman he had conspired to destroy. Then Esther placed Mordecai over all of it. The signet ring that had once authorized a decree of destruction was now on Mordecai's hand, authorizing a decree of protection and provision. This is the law of plunder operating at kingdom scale. The same legal authority the enemy used to sign a death warrant was simply redirected through God's perfect timing. No new law was needed, no revolution was required. The existing system was turned on its head by one woman who had done 3 days of invisible work before she took a single visible step. And Proverbs chapter 13, verse 22, had already named this outcome long before it happened. A sinner's wealth is stored up for the righteous, not promised in a vague, hopeful sense. Stored up, set aside, held in reserve, waiting for the correct moment of release and the correct person to receive it. Esther did not create that wealth. She positioned herself through fasting and strategic patience and a transformed mind to be in the right place when the moment of transfer came. King Solomon, who understood the foundations of generational provision better than any ruler in recorded history, wrote in Proverbs chapter 8, verse 21, I will fill their treasuries, not offer, not consider, fill. And Solomon makes clear throughout Proverbs that wisdom is the qualifying factor, not aggression, not manipulation, not even hard work alone. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 7 says it plainly, Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom. And in all your getting, get understanding. Wisdom is what protects a transfer once it arrives, and this is the part most people skip entirely. History is full of people who received sudden provision and lost it within a single generation because they had no framework in place to sustain what they had been given. Esther did not just receive Haman's estate and celebrate. She immediately appointed the right steward, Mordecai, a man who had refused to bow to corrupt power even when his life was on the line, a man whose integrity had already been tested in public. She sealed the transfer with discernment rather than emotion and built a system around the provision to protect it across time. The Jews went on to establish the Feast of Purim, a perpetual and generational remembrance of the reversal. Esther, chapter 9, verse 28 records, "These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family. Generational wealth is not only money, it is memory. It is the deliberate act of teaching the next generation how the provision came, what it cost, and how it must be honored and maintained. That is how the seal holds." Watchman Nee spent decades teaching one concept that most believers acknowledge in theory but rarely apply in practice. Spiritual authority is not given to those who demand it, but to those who submit to it. In his foundational teaching on spiritual authority, Nee made a distinction that runs directly through the heart of the Esther story. He taught that God's authority is absolute, and the person who walks in genuine alignment under that authority carries its weight into every room they enter, every negotiation they begin, every request they make. Esther did not engineer the king's sleepless night. She did not orchestrate the moment the chronicles were opened to the right page. She did not time Haman's fall. She simply placed herself in correct spiritual alignment during 3 days that no one else could see, and the authority of heaven moved every natural circumstance into position around her. That is the principle that makes this strategy executable today, in your actual life, in a climate that feels increasingly unpredictable and hostile to ordinary people trying to build something lasting. Markets shift, decrees go out, economic decrees, political decrees, cultural decrees, that seem to lock your financial future in a direction you never chose. The natural response is to react immediately, to start negotiating from panic, to start building contingency plans while fear is still running the room. The Esther strategy says something completely different. It says, stop first, not forever, not passively, strategically. 3 days to realign your mind, your spirit, and your discernment before you take a single visible step. 3 days to move from reaction into positioning because you cannot recognize the golden scepter if your eyes are still full of the threat. And you cannot see the window that Sir John Templeton described, that moment of maximum pessimism where the greatest reversals are purchased, if your decisions are being driven by the noise of the crisis rather than the clarity that comes from being genuinely settled on the inside. The scepter always extends toward the one who approaches in the right posture, at the right time, with a request that has been refined by patience rather than distorted by urgency. After those 3 days, Esther moved with precision. She did not expose everything at once. She sequenced her actions. She served before she asked. She waited for the atmosphere to be fully ready, and when she finally named her request, she named it from a certainty that the answer was already held in reserve and waiting for this exact moment to be released. Your Haman, whatever financial structure has been erected against your provision, whatever signed decree seems to be moving against your inheritance right now, is already walking toward a fall that it built for someone else. You do not need to destroy it. You need to position yourself so that when it falls, what was stored up lands in your hands. That same day, those 4 words carry the entire weight of this story. Not eventually, not in a distant season after years of grinding. On that same day that Haman was exposed, the estate transferred. On that same day, the king could not sleep. The debt of honor began to move toward repayment. God's reversals are not slow. They are precise, and they are already in motion for the one who has done the invisible work of alignment before the visible moment arrives. Keep watching this channel. What you are learning here is not financial theory dressed in Bible verses. It is the original code, the way provision has always worked, the same pattern running from Esther's throne room to your living room, from ancient Persia to wherever you are sitting right now. Ancient wealth is not a concept. It is a pattern. And once you truly see it, You will never read a crisis the same way again. May the Lord extend his scepter toward you in the very season when every decree says it is too late.